a cleaner grid and a more decentralized grid. So the first major piece of legislation that passed occurred in 2018, the Grid Transformation and Security Act. We call it the Grid Mod Bill. And this was really the first bill that looked at how we plan to make significant investments in our electric system over the next decade, recognizing that we have lots of new resources, including solar and wind, smart meters and smart technology and energy efficiency, as well as electrification of our vehicle fleets that are all transforming our electricity system in ways that need to be adapted to. So we worked with the General Assembly in 2018 on the GTSA. What that bill did at that time is it took additional categories of solar and wind energy projects and deemed them in the public interest. So up until that point, 500 megawatts of solar and wind was deemed in the public interest. We saw a tenfold increase in that in the GTSA to 5,500 megawatts of solar and wind. And I think that many of you have seen a related increase in project applications in your jurisdictions, as much of that megawatt investment has come through utility scale projects that are being cited in your jurisdictions. I will also mention, because I think it's important for us to recognize that there's also some complementary policies around energy efficiency investments. In many localities, you have your own energy efficiency targets. We at the state have a fairly robust energy efficiency program, and certainly that is a central component of all of these aspects moving forward. We all want to be able to save money on our electric bills by making targeted investments in energy efficiency, whether it's at our schools or our municipal buildings or in other structures that we oversee. So after we saw the Grid Transformation and Security Act pass the General Assembly session, the governor worked with a number of stakeholders and issued Executive Order 43 in the fall of last year. And what that EO did is it really built upon the work in the GTSA and set sort of a more comprehensive plan for how we achieve not just the goals that were established in the 2018 legislation, but also a longer term planning vision to how we get to 100% carbon-free electricity by 2050, which is certainly where our electricity companies were moving toward. For example, Dominion announced a 100% carbon-free target by 2045. So we really wanted to ensure that we were doing this in a strategic way, in a thoughtful way, and in an incremental way. There were also some provisions in that executive order that really targeted how that 5,500 megawatts of solar and wind would be deployed, including a significant deployment of 3,000 megawatts by 2022. So really staging that investment over a period of time, but recognizing that some of the federal tax incentives, for example, would be running out in the next couple of years. So really trying to get as much of those investments in the Commonwealth as possible. And then, of course, complementary to the solar and onshore wind work is offshore wind, which for our Hampton Roads and Eastern Shore jurisdictions that are on this call, that is a huge economic development opportunity for us. We have a really strong partnership with DMME, the Virginia Economic Development Partnership, VEDP, and the Port Authority. All three of those are working hand in hand to really drive investment in those communities on offshore wind, and we really see that as an important and complementary tool to the other renewable energy investments that we're seeing. And then the last piece of legislation, of course, that was teed up at the start of this call is the Clean Economy Act. So that really took the GTSA and the executive order and sort of codified all of those provisions in a really, I think, concerted and thoughtful way. So it gets to that 100% carbon-free target by 2045. So that mirrors where some of the utilities were moving. It also, over the next 20 years, aims a significant amount of new solar and onshore wind in the public interest. So again, increasing from 5,500 megawatts in the GTSA, which that was over 10 years, to 16,100 megawatts of solar and onshore wind. All of that is over a 20-year period. And then 5,200 megawatts of offshore wind. So that really builds on the work that I mentioned, started with the executive order, setting out the primary goal of 2,500 megawatts, but then really builds on that and expands the opportunities, not just off of the Virginia coast, but also bringing jobs and investment to Hampton Roads to develop offshore wind projects off the North Carolina coast or off the Delmarva Peninsula. All right, so we'll go into the next slide. So I talked a little bit about Executive Order 43. This sort of at a high level sets the targets. So 30% renewable energy by 2030. That's our state target. So for our Commonwealth's agencies and institutions, we set a goal of achieving 30% of our energy by renewables by 2030. We actually met that early because we signed a comprehensive contract with Dominion Energy. We're purchasing the energy from a number of utility scale solar and one onshore wind facility if that does get its final approval, and that will get us as a Commonwealth to 30% actually by the end of Governor Northam's term. The 30% by 2030, of course, includes the entire electric system, so that will also be part of the Clean Economy Act that I'll talk to you about. And then 100% clean energy by 2050, as I mentioned. And then the last piece, which I think we all recognize, is just as these investments are being made, we need to make sure that there is equity, both in terms of the jobs that are created, ensuring that there's equal access to those jobs, but also to the investment that will be underway in these communities. All right, so next slide. So this is my last slide before I turn it over to Carrie, who's really doing a lot of the boots on the ground work on solar energy across Virginia, ensuring that all of our stakeholders are sort of well versed on all of the legislative provisions that are in place and just the tremendous amount of work that DMME is doing in this space. But as I mentioned, there were some significant pieces of legislation that passed this session that further propel renewable energy forward across the Commonwealth. The Clean Economy Act, as I mentioned, sets that 100% carbon-free requirement, and it actually does it in a way where it embodies a renewable portfolio standard where our utilities have to make certain investments in renewable energy or buy what's called a renewable energy certificate to comply with the RPS. And that target is the 30% renewable energy by 2030. The Clean Energy and Community Flood Preparedness Act is the piece of legislation that codifies Virginia joining the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. This is something that started a number of years ago via a regulatory program that the Department of Environmental Quality established, but now it has been formally approved by the General Assembly, and the Department of Environmental Quality will be able to actually use the proceeds that come in from the RGGI auction, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative auction, for two things. One is resilience-related investments, and the other is a comprehensive energy efficiency program that will be managed at the Department of Housing and Community Development. So number 3 is some solar-specific bills, and I'm sure Carrie will give a bit more detail about those. Many of you have probably seen the revenue share. That's for utility scale solar. That bill has been discussed for a number of years, but did pass this General Assembly session. And basically what that does is it gives localities an alternative vehicle to the M&T tax. They can assess a revenue share of up to $1,400 per megawatt of generation capacity on a solar project that is greater than 5 megawatts. So just ensuring that those larger utility scale solar projects have an additional opportunity for local governments to assess a revenue provision, whether it's the M&T tax or the revenue share agreement. So the second bill is actually, it's a couple of bills that passed. It was called the Solar Freedom Bill. This bill really addresses more of the rooftop distributed solar sector. So it's not as much the utility scale side, although there could be some impacts on utility scale. For example, if there is a community solar installation, those may be larger. But what this bill does is it increased the net metering provisions, the power purchase agreement provisions. It really focused on some of the provisions that there had been some incremental movement over the years on, increase those provisions to allow for a greater investment in distributed rooftop solar. And And then the last piece is CPACE. That's the Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy Financing. Some of the jurisdictions I'm sure on this call have CPACE ordinances in place. What we heard from many localities across the Commonwealth is that you really needed a more comprehensive statewide program on CPACE. And so that's what our legislation does. It authorizes DMME to contract with a statewide administrator who local governments can utilize to help administer a CPACE program in your jurisdiction. That program will go into place July 1st. Unfortunately, the budget item that was associated with it to hire that program administrator, just like all new funding requests, is on hold right now until the General Assembly comes back and votes on the next fiscal year budget. So all new appropriations are on hold. But that legislation is there, and at some point we hope that we'll be able to stand up that statewide administrator program. So with that, I will turn it over to Carrie, who I'm sure will give much more detail about the utility scale solar work that we have underway. Thank you.
Angela, that's a great overview and framework, and there was just a tremendous amount of work that went on in this legislative session. So just a recognition to the amount of work that went into all of this. I'm going to touch briefly on some work that we're doing around the revenue share model before I move off of this slide, and then we can go into sort of the state of affairs in terms of where we are with utility scale solar and other programs. But I wanted to give reference to the revenue share piece because from what we've heard, there's a lot of interest from localities in how to best make that decision of whether or not there's path to enact an ordinance that would move in the direction to use the revenue share model and comparing that to the M&T tax model. And so I'm interested in hearing from you all on that later on, but also wanted to just give a quick update that we're considering creating a decision-making tool that would take into the consideration, the finances involved in each of those decisions, so that that can be provided to localities when they're considering those options. So I'll move on to the next slide. Just recognition here that obviously across the globe, there's tremendous impact from COVID-19 on the economy and various sectors across the board. And here, just a quick highlight that the Solar Energy Industry Association, hold on, I'm just going to decline a request here. SEIA has estimated that 80% of projects in the solar industry are either on hold or delayed. And then I saw yesterday that MDVSEIA, the regional solar trade association that's active in Virginia, put out numbers specific to Virginia. So I just recommend you take a look at some of those numbers and understand the impact, and anything that we can do to enable solar development and have that industry rebound as quickly as possible is just really important for the number of people that are directly impacted. So the Permit by Rule program, as many know, is administered through Department of Environmental Quality, and these are for projects between 5 megawatts and 150 megawatts. And you all may have seen a version of this slide from last year at the annual meeting. The numbers have been updated to where they are currently. And this just goes over the number of permits that are either in the notice of intent pipeline or that have issued their permit by rule, and the number of acres projected. And a link here, if this presentation is shared, to DEQ's site. And then this map is also housed at DEQ and shows the distribution of systems at the utility scale side. And you can see that there's not as much activity in Southwest. And so some of the projects that we at DMME are working on involve assessing abandoned mine lands and other projects that could attract the solar industry into Southwest Virginia to bring those related jobs and economic development opportunities into Southwest, while also utilizing those brownfields and moving them into active renewable energy production sites. And then these next two maps are from the National Solar Energy Industry Association and show where we are currently. This is as of 2019 with installed solar capacity, and then the forecast for solar across the board. This goes out to 2024. And I know these numbers are probably going to look very different after COVID, but hoping to get it back on track as soon as possible. But this really just shows the distribution between residential, solar, commercial and industrial, non-residential, and then utility scale. And so it's probably similar to the experience that many of you have on the ground in terms of where you're seeing the volume of comments from the public or applications and the scale of solar that you're seeing as that distribution. And I think this does also just really point to the importance of a balance between residential, non-residential, and utility scale, and that we need all three of those. And so I have some other information later on that kind of points to that as well. These are just a number of the considerations that we recognize come alongside solar development across Virginia and across anywhere in the country. And so DMME is going to be working on a number of these areas to do research and create some stakeholder groups that will help us identify guiding principles and best practices around some of these areas. And so we always are interested in hearing your thoughts on these topics. I referenced the brownfields to bright fields in Southwest, but those are certainly great opportunities in many jurisdictions that have maybe industrial brownfields that can be thought about for converting to solar projects. There's other topics on here. We've seen DEQ take the lead on a pollinator SMART program that just was rolled out earlier this year. And we also understand that there's a lot of economic benefits in using sheep, for example, for grazing on solar sites in terms of reducing the amount of maintenance that is required over the course of that program or that project. So there's a lot on this list. We're going to be looking at this strategically and identifying other stakeholders that can support us in evaluating topics, for example, decommissioning and best practices. We understand from many localities that there's questions around some of these components, and we're very early on in the industry in terms of the utility scale side and haven't necessarily gotten to that end of life phase to really go through that full decommissioning process, for example. But there's a lot of good research coming out of national organizations like NREL and others that can provide that guidance and give an informative recommendation in terms of how does that get implemented into either a conditional use permit or solar ordinances or other guidance. And then Angela, I think, spoke to the headline here in the middle around last year, Governor Northam announcing the largest state renewable energy contract in the nation. But certainly we've seen a lot of other headlines as well, and understand that this, there are a lot of thoughts on all sides, and we need to provide balancing information and guidance to help navigate this process, as we're only going to see an increase in utility scale solar going forward. And so that is part of our job. One of the things that I've been working on with the University of Virginia's Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service is working on developing a set of solar related questions that will be put together in a survey that the Center for Survey Research is also helping to guide. And big shout out to VACo, as well as all of these other organizations who have provided input so far in terms of what that survey can cover and what it will look like. And we had to slow down the process a little bit once the COVID emergency took hold, but we are still working on the survey, and this is a heads up that you all should probably see something hopefully early this summer. And so again, I and Elizabeth Marshall from the University of Virginia have been taking the lead, and look forward to really having a data-driven approach in terms of where various localities are in the pre-application process or application process with solar developers, as well as challenges and what has worked well from a planning perspective, and how we can offer more support and guidance around particular topics. So speaking of the balanced approach, this is one, net metering and distributed generation is one area that we've seen a huge exponential curve in the development of rooftop solar. And so I'm going to move on to our announcement, which is if you all receive, I'm sure you do, you receive the VACo newsletter. You probably received an announcement that DMME and UVA have partnered to offer a no-cost technical assistance program. We just launched this week. We've been gearing up for this and put out our press release yesterday. And this is a program that some of you may be already familiar with. About 20 or 21 localities across the state have already earned their SolSmart designation. And SolSmart is a program that is, it's put forth by the Solar Foundation through Department of Energy funding. And so we have become trained as SolSmart technical advisors to bring additional information to localities and work through the process of looking at comprehensive planning or zoning practices, permitting, and how information can be displayed and shared transparently with the public so that individuals or businesses or developers who are working on their plans to incorporate solar in their their decisions or their models can have that access to information. And the goal is to reduce the soft costs and streamline it to make it less time consuming and an easier process all around, so that tax dollars can be spent wisely, and there's just a clear understanding of how an individual or an entity can move forward with solar in that particular area. So we're currently recruiting in the Middle Peninsula as well as the South Side area, two regions where we understand that there's been a lot of activity, and areas where we think that we can provide some additional assistance through the SolSmart model, as well as looking at Southwest Virginia and going further. Last year they received their bronze designation, and we're hoping to offer additional assistance to see about transitioning abandoned mine lands to utility scale solar host sites. So with that, we invite you to submit a request for a consultation if you're interested. It's on our DMME website. You can link it here, and we can send out that link as well. It's already in the VACo newsletter, and I'm happy to answer any questions later on. This is my contact info, and I know we've already gone over time, so thank you very much for attending and appreciate it. Do you want me to stop sharing, Joe?
Yeah, I'll see if I can move the ball over or just move it to me. I think I should be able to do it. Yeah, I'm able to do it.
Okay.
I think we're.
Well, this is Chris from VACo. Carrie and Angela, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us. It was good hearing your voices, and Angela, it's good seeing you on the video. It's been too long, so it was nice to get even a virtual experience with y'all. We did have a couple of questions I wanted to raise. I'll also remind people that if they want to ask any questions, please shoot them to me in the chat function, so that way I can ask them and we won't go too crazy with unmuted lines. One question for both or either of you, in the presentation, we discussed kind of the COVID-19 impact on the solar industry and kind of what we're looking at right now, kind of with projects that are in the queue. And I was wondering maybe what you're hearing from groups like MDVC when it comes to not just what is happening, but kind of what they're looking at prospectively, or what the future may hold for the solar industry and these projects as we still grapple with COVID-19.
Yeah, Chris, that's a great question. I can start and then Carrie can certainly fill in the gaps. We've been having calls with a number of the trade organizations and many of the industry partners across the Commonwealth that are still moving forward on projects. I think, the pipeline certainly has slowed. They're looking to the federal government for requests that they have pending to transition the tax credit into more of an equity position, allowing developers to cash that out, because unfortunately that market has sort of dried up. So I think that's been one of the limitations. I will say in a lot of other states, the construction industry was an industry that governors limited via executive order. We did not do that in Virginia. So many of our construction projects have continued forward. I'm sure many of you have seen construction projects in your own jurisdictions. And a lot of localities have transitioned to virtual meetings and virtual approvals. So we are, in that sense, seeing a steady flow of projects. I think that there are certainly questions and uncertainties about the market, the financial markets, the liquidity markets, those sorts of things. But by and large, I feel as though most of the companies that we're talking to are relatively optimistic, especially with this new legislation that does create a path to market for many of these new projects that will be coming online. And I know in many conversations I've had with Dominion over the last couple of weeks, they're still moving forward on a number of projects as well.
I would just add that I'm still seeing projects that are hiring in the large scale solar side. So I think that's a good sign, but it's not without its challenges, of course. And then on the rooftop side, I think there are tools and recommendations in terms of how localities can still provide that permitting. And so there are some resources that have come out in the last couple of months from both the Solar Foundation as well as SEIA around how to implement that online permitting if it's not already online. And so I would encourage localities to really consider how they can beef up those online resources so that those don't necessarily get stalled for the sake of not being able to do an in-person permit.
Thanks. We also have another question that just came in. I'm going to quickly read it. Louisa County has 3 pending applications that will be going to a public hearing as soon as we're able to have the public meetings again. There are nearly 400 megawatts pending on action. I understand that there are opportunities for reasonable cash proffers for the locality in addition to the revenue sharing option. Can you discuss that legislation regarding proffer contributions?
I don't know that I'd be able to speak as intelligently to that bill without it in front of me. I apologize.
Well, hey, this is Joe Lurch. I think, Chris, when we get to Jeff Gore, he can speak to that in a little more detail when we go over the tax or the land use bills with Delegate Heretic.
That would be great. Those bills went through our finance secretariat, so while I did review them, they weren't directly under our jurisdiction.
But that wraps up the questions that I had in my queue. So thanks again, and I guess I'll relinquish the microphone.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Joe.
Okay, this is the Joe. Do you have anything you want to say before I introduce the next group?
Nope, that's great.
Okay. Yeah. Hey, Angela, Carrie, thank y'all very much, both of you. A lot of information absorbed, and we appreciate both of you taking the time to give us this presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thanks for your leadership. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
All right, so on the next on the agenda, if you follow with me, which I look like I misplaced it here. Here it is, a local taxation of utility scale solar equipment. The first person I want to introduce you is Jeff Gore. If you're in any way active in VACo, he's a face that you see at all the meetings, very much so engaged in local government. Jeff Gore is an attorney at Hefty, Wiley, and Gore, DC, where he represents a variety of local and regional government entities as general legal counsel and as a lobbyist before the Virginia legislation and regulatory agencies. Handle public procurement matters, employee grievances, child protective services cases, freedom of information act compliance, land use and zoning issues, and other matters. He also assists localities and corporations with identifying, negotiating economic development incentive for projects involving significant private sector investment. Also going to be speaking on this subject is one of our own, Joe Lurch, who previously came from our cousins, DMME, but we're glad to have him with VACo. Joe has worked as a planner for the cities of Fairfax and Richmond and Spotsylvania County. He's also served as planning commissioner for the city of Fredericksburg. And various professional memberships include American Institute of Certified Planners, the Virginia chapter of the American Planning Association, the Virginia Rural Planning Caucus, and the National Association of Counties. With that said, Mr. Jeff Gore, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you for coming today. Appreciate it.
All right. Well, and talk to Jeff, Mr. President. I'm going to kick it off and then take it over to Jeff. And Jeff, let us know if you can unmute yourself, because if that's a problem too, we can get John Candris online to do that for you.
How's this?
Yes. Good.
Okay.
I can hear you. Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. What I'm going to do is just run over the two bills dealing with taxation of solar equipment at the local level. And then after I introduce each bill, I talk about the bills and the mechanics of them. I'm then going to turn it over to Jeff, because Jeff is more of the practitioner at the local level. He works for many counties, is on contract as a county attorney and working in many counties, and so he can give that perspective. The one thing I wanted to do before I get into the two bills, and we've done this in numerous presentations, but just to kind of lay the framework, starting back in 2014 and then with amendment in 2016, there was a exemption a mandated exemption on solar equipment, particularly at the utility scale, that was put in place by the General Assembly. And in the beginning, when we had projects that were in the 5 to 20 megawatt range, it didn't have too much of an impact. But once we started getting to these larger projects, it was having an impact on the local finances at the local level. In 2018, VACo was successful in at least capping that mandatory exemption so that it didn't apply to projects of 150 megawatts or greater. So that just kind of lays the groundwork before we went into this next session. So the first bill we're going to talk about, and Angela did a great job explaining it, and she did explain it as a revenue share. You could call it the energy tax as well. I think revenue share is a way to take tax out of it when you're doing legislation. That always helps. But essentially, it provides the option for locality, if they're going to do by ordinance, they could replace their machinery and tool tax with a tax of up to 114 megawatts per megawatt of capacity installed, and that's AC, alternating current. Now, when this bill becomes effective July 1st, it's not going to apply retroactively to any projects for which an application has already been filed by July 1st of 2020. Now, the one thing, though, that is interesting in this, and it was part of, I think, the concession that the industry wanted to make sure was in the bill, was, however, an applicant or an owner of a previously approved project could enter into a voluntary agreement with the locality to be subject to the energy tax. So that's something that they thought was important to be in the bill to work with localities. Now, it does extend the state mandate for those projects that are going to be under M&T. It extends it from 2024 to 2030. The way that the law exists now is that if for projects greater than 20 megawatts, if you haven't begun construction by January 2024, the mandatory exemption doesn't apply. It becomes a voluntary at the local level. That's actually scaled back now to anything greater than 5 megawatts, which is an improvement, but that has been extended to 2030. Jeff, I don't know if you wanted to touch, how you see this working at the local level before I turn it over to you. I thought it was great that Carrie talked about DMME coming up with kind of an online decision tool about how to make, if you're going to make the switch to energy tax versus M&T. And VACo would definitely like to offer any analysis we can on helping develop the tool, because we really had crunched the numbers on this when this legislation was being considered last summer and into the legislative session. So with Jeff, Jeff, I'll hand it over to you for your comments.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I mean, first, I think we need to take a step back because there was so much activity this session on solar and a lot of new land use tools and tax tools that you really kind of have to look at all of these together to sort of see, put it all together to see how it makes sense in your county and for particular projects. The revenue share, I think there's some potential advantages to it, certainly. First of all, it does require an ordinance as a technical matter to adopt the revenue share. But there are some advantages. I mean, for example, the $1,400 per megawatt, for the life of the project, that's a known number, right? So that's something that there's certainty with that. And with that certainty, you can contrast that to the M&T revenue, where you have a pretty steep fall off based on depreciation schedules after year 10 or 11 typically. So there's an advantage in that kind of steady income. But and with that steady known number is the potential to actually bond off of it, to finance debt with it. And I hear the solar industry talk about that advantage to the revenue share approach. That may be the case. I haven't talked to any banks yet. I mean, I'm in the beginning stages of some projects where a revenue share ordinance probably will be adopted, but we haven't gotten to the stage of, talking, going out to the financial markets because, for one thing, if you do the math, $1,400 a megawatt on a 20 megawatt project is $28,000 a year. It's only $140,000 a year for a 100 megawatt project. So to get to the kind of numbers where you're really going to be to significantly be able to leverage this for, financing some sort of larger infrastructure, you're going to have to get up in the higher scale projects. But there is some advantages to having that sort of known number and that certainty. I think we've already heard the concerns, DMME, folks mentioned. One calculation needs to be made is the M&T versus the revenue share, because the revenues, they're mutually exclusive. You're going to do one or the other going forward. And I think that's something each locality is going to have to start looking at as you have projects in the pipeline or applications in the pipeline. It's great to hear that DMME is going to put together a tool to help with that. I know right now local finance directors and commissioners of revenue and county administrators are all sort of working on trying to sort this out. So you can having some sort of independent third-party tool that comes from the state to make that assessment would be very helpful. Because I think I've seen both sides of the argument. I've seen calculations that show for a 75 or 100 megawatt project that the M&T actually over the life of it would produce more revenue. But I've seen this same project show numbers that are reverse of that the revenue share would be more advantageous. So I mean, when it comes down to just looking at the revenue, I think that's something that you need to look at, because some folks have asked me, if we adopt the revenue share ordinance, does that then mean every future project that comes in that's within the greater than 5 megawatts, does that mean we have to apply the ordinance? And we we can't pick and choose. In other words, if for some projects it makes sense to fall back on the M&T, and some projects it makes sense to do the revenue share. And my answer to that is, I think this is like a tax. I mean, that's what it is. And when you adopt an ordinance that applies a tax to a use, or in this case to an amount of energy produced, I think that probably needs to be applied uniformly. There could be constitutional issues if you pick and choose how you apply that tax. So, I think at this point, unless someone does some research and convinces me otherwise, I think you're making a decision that's a long-term one, to go with the revenue share or go with the M&T. So, again,
Jeff?
Yes.
This is Chris with VACo. Just had a quick question that came in before you get off this bullet. Is the 1,400 per megawatt per rated capacity megawatts or actual megawatts produced? Considering output decreases over time, would this then mean that the revenue share decreased too?
It's the way I read the language, Chris. It's for capacity. So I think it's whatever the rated capacity is. So it's not actual usage. The output, the way I read it. And the other thing is it's an up to number. So theoretically, a locality could adopt a lower share. But I think the DMME tool will help, hopefully. But there's other concerns before we leave this bullet, Chris and Joe. I mean, this is statutory, right? So what the General Assembly puts in statute, it can change. You would think that any statutory revenue share numbers projects would be grandfathered if they were approved at a certain number, and they wouldn't if the number goes down lower. But anyway, there is some uncertainty. I was talking about how certain the revenue share is versus M&T, but there's always the uncertainty of the legislative process too. But this is a new tool, and I think whether you go with revenue share or the M&T, we'll talk later about the other tools, because they all need to be looked at simultaneously.
And this is Joe. Before we go to the next slide, Jeff, maybe a question that's come up is, if you adopt the revenue share ordinance, does that have to apply to all solar projects, or could you differentiate between ones that are less than 5 megawatts or more than 150 megawatts? Would there be limitations on that? Because I think that's part of the calculus for some of our members. They may see larger projects that would be over 150 megawatts where there is no mandatory exemption, and would they have to apply the revenue share to that because they've adopted it wholesale at the local level?
Yeah, that's a great question. First, looking at projects under 150, I think the statute applies revenue sharing to projects that are greater than 5 megawatts. There's some other exceptions dealing with agriculture and small generators and generator for use on site, some other things. But if it's a utility scale to be connected to the grid, then generally it's going to apply to anything that's greater than 5 megawatts. So that issue, I flag that issue, because I think that is a valid point for potentially future legislative sessions. Does it make sense for a 100 megawatt or 20 megawatt project to be treated the same way as a 200 or larger megawatt project? So I think right now, Joe, the law would apply the same. Your ordinance would apply to those larger projects. And I don't think you could pick and choose. Again, I think you go back to a sort of a uniformity of taxation issue, which is the constitutional one. But I do think the General Assembly could shape the statute to have different tiers, even different rates when you get to higher levels of energy capacity. So I think that's a great discussion, going forward as this evolves.
All right. One more quick question on this slide before we move on. I'm sorry to interrupt. Does filing an application mean when the application is submitted and fee paid or approved? I assume it would not apply to just inquiries or pre-applications.
My take is once it's filed and it's going to your planning commission for consideration and then your board. So, I think once the staff and the applicant agree the application's complete, I think it's filed. But I don't think any preliminary discussions would count. But the other thing, as Joe mentioned, there is the leeway that's found in the enactment clauses in the bill, second enactment clauses, that do allow for the applicant to sort of opt in to, and there could be a scenario where it makes sense. The applicant may want to opt into your ordinance even if they filed before the deadline. And there's also a provision for if there's an existing revenue, voluntary payment agreement that some counties have entered into because we didn't have these statutory tools yet. So there are a handful of these voluntary agreements out there that could potentially, under this legislation, transform into the revenue share ordinance.
That's correct, yes. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. So the second big bill dealing with this is what we call kind of a step-down reduction in the mandatory M&T exemption. And the way that this works is that it reduces the mandatory exemption after the first 5 years of operation. So for years 6 through 10, that mandatory exemption drops from 80% to 70%. And then from years 11 and beyond, that exemption drops to 60%. Now this applies for any project for which an interconnection request has been remade to either the incumbent electric utility or the regional transmission organization, which in this case would be PMJ, on or after January 1, 2019. So I think this would apply to a lot of the projects that are in the queue, kind of our analysis. So this will be, I think, some positive revenue should you stick with the M&T. I also note that it did the same extension of the mandate from the local tax to 2030, from currently set to expire in 2024. And before I hand it over to Jeff for maybe just a little more analysis, it is, Jeff had mentioned that years 11 and beyond, and just so we're all clear, for any project greater than 25 megawatts, and if it's greater than 25 megawatts, what we're seeing is it's really 50 megawatts or greater. The SCC does the evaluation, the State Corporation Commission, and that's that depreciation schedule, which really drops off. And we've talked about this in previous webinars, how that kind of really hurts the math on the M&T. And so while this is an improvement for those larger projects, it may not be quite an improvement as you start to drop off. And so, Jeff, I don't know if you wanted to add any other comments, and maybe one other thing before I move on, because I saw a question in the chat about, does VACo have any, recommendations of going M&T or revenue share? We wouldn't, but what we would say is that it really depends on your tax structure at the local level. Because of a quirk in law, anything greater than 25 megawatts for any energy facility, you tax it at your real estate rate versus your M&T rate. And those vary from county to county. For instance, I've seen, real estate rates as low as 38 cents, maybe in Lunenburg, but you start to get up to counties like Culpeper and others where you're seeing these large installations and you're going twice that rate. So it really depends on your local math and how your M&T works versus your real estate. So Jeff, I don't know if you had anything to add.
Not a lot. I think this bill speaks for itself. It does what it does, and I think you need to talk to your finance folks and your commissioners of revenue just to make sure you have a handle on it. Just going back just very briefly to the prior slide, I've heard some talk of are there going to be model ordinances for the revenue share? I think there probably will be. I think some localities are going to be adopting some of these in the soon after July 1, but there's really not much to what that ordinance will contain, because really the statute is pretty simple and establishes a number, and you have to adopt an ordinance to do that. So I don't we'll talk more about things like, it came up earlier about proffers, but it's actually a special exception issue. We'll talk about that, and then Tom Swartzwelder and Delegate Hodges are going to talk about the siting agreement. Those are things where we're going to get into sort of negotiations and sort of the art of that, versus this ordinance for revenue share is pretty straightforward.
Mr. President, I think we could probably move on to our next presenter, Delegate Heretic, and Jeff will help him too on the next slide.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Jeff. And Jeff, you're going to be with us. You're going to stay with us here on this next presentation as well, right, sir?
Yes, sir.
Right. All right, thank you, Jeff. All right, I'd like to introduce the Honorable Steve Heretic, and before we got started this morning, he's very busy. He's been, I mean, this evening he was doing some work trying to get to this meeting. We definitely appreciate you being here, Delegate. The Honorable Steve Heretic represents the 79th District in Virginia, the House of Delegates, representing parts of the cities of Chesapeake, Norfolk, and Portsmouth. He serves on the Finance Committee as chair of the subcommittee that deals with local tax policy, the Labor and Commerce as the chair of subcommittee on insurance, the Courts Committee, and the County, Cities, and Towns Committee as chair of the subcommittee on land use planning. Steve served on the Portsmouth City Council from 2005 to 2012. During his tenure, Steve served as the chair of the Hampton Roads Regional Jail Authority, on the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission, and many other boards and commissions. And Delegate, we are certainly thankful that you're here today and taking the time to have these discussions, and especially anything to do with land use and zoning. That can be a touchy subject. So I'm turning it over to you, sir. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Steve, and good afternoon, everybody. I can tell you that, with the Virginia Clean Economy Act and all the bills that passed the General Assembly this year, we're keenly mindful that with the goal of making Virginia a completely renewable energy state by 2045, that's an aggressive time frame. And to keep, things moving along on that track, we need to give localities the tools and the authority that you need to get this all done within that time. I was a little struck by the earlier map that we saw from DMME about solar projects around Virginia. I recognize that there are a good many of them. When you see it on a map, you begin to get the idea that things are happening very, very quickly. I know that 3 or 4 years ago, North Carolina, our neighbor to the south, had about 10 times as many solar projects as we did. And I think we're tracking right now to catch up with them and to exceed them in a very short time frame. So one of the things that we wanted to do, and as you mentioned, I come from local government, so I'm keenly aware that sometimes the General Assembly doesn't have the best and brightest ideas on how to do things. We wanted to give you all the tools and the authority that you need to begin to deal with these projects as they come to you. And I want to talk briefly about 3 bills that I introduced this year that were passed, which begin to sort of tee up the things that you will need to wrestle with going forward. And let me just go through them quickly. And I'll turn it back to Jeff because, he's the guy, one of the guys that gets to actually deal with this. The first is House Bill 655, which creates a brand new section under 15.2 2288.8. which gives you the optional local authority to create special exceptions for solar energy projects. And also, and there was a question a little bit earlier, which gives localities the authority to grant conditions, and I shouldn't use this word out loud, but they're called proffers, to require that developers who are looking to do solar developments in your localities to either offer substantial property of substantial value or cash payments for construction and other infrastructure development needs that are related to the project. And I think that we do recognize that in many, especially rural areas, we're seeing solar projects really taking the place of agriculture. And we understand that those bring unique challenges to your localities, and to deal with those things. Not only do you need, tax revenue, which we've already discussed to some extent, but you need the ability to turn to the developer and say, look, if we need infrastructure developments are going to be caused by this development, you need the authority to ask them to do it. So that was the entire purpose behind House Bill 655, and that was approved by the governor actually pretty quickly after the session was over. The second of the 3 bills is House Bill 656. And this allows you to include in your zoning ordinance, and this is under section 15.2 2286, there's a big long laundry list of things that you can include in your zoning ordinances. This allows, going way back in the statute, the ability to require to incorporate generally accepted environmental and safety product standards for the types of equipment that are going to be introduced in your localities in terms of solar panel and battery technologies. And these include such things as National Sanitation Foundation, NSF, American National Standards Institute requirements, International Electrical Technology Commission numbers, and underwriter laboratory passage, so that you will have the ability to designate to developers what they can and cannot introduce in your localities. And the third of these three bills is House Bill 657, which basically creates some amendments to Section 15.2, 2232, which allows your local planning commission, whenever you're looking at a comprehensive plan, to include in the comprehensive plan the ability for localities to waive the requirement that certain solar facilities be reviewed for substantial accord. Now, individually, these bills they're not large bills. But again, what we're trying to do is to give you the toolkit that you will need to begin to address these types of projects going forward. Now, certainly we recognize that in the next few years, we're going to be seeing additional types of needs that your localities have that we haven't thought of. And I want to encourage you and take this opportunity as sort of a public service announcement to encourage you to reach out to those of us who are working in this subject area and let us know what additional legislation you're going to need. You know, we want the Clean Economy Act to work in Virginia, and we want it to make it work for all of Virginia. We want to make sure that by 2045 rather, we are carbon free in terms of our energy source. We want to make it renewable. And we recognize that to make that happen, we've got a lot of work to do with you to put those tools in place that allow you to do your jobs. So with that, I would turn it over to Jeff and for comments. And Jeff, I'm sure you'll let us know how badly we've blown it and what else we need to fix. But anyway, I want to let you know that we're working on this. It is constantly a work in progress. And before I just be quiet, I just want to acknowledge Delegate Keith Hodges, who worked with us quite a bit on forming some of these legislative initiatives. And Keith, if you're on, thank you very much. And Jeff, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Delegate, and thank you for all your work this session on this issue. I mean, you really took the lead and had a whole sort of suite of bills that are very important, I think. Don't undersell them, particularly, I think, the special exception bill. In my experience anyway, and people can comment if they have a different experience, but typically these projects are going to undergo a special exception permitting process. Some call it conditional use permit. So it's either going to be a CUP or a SCP. Rarely are these uses designated as by right, even in certain ag districts. That happens from time to time. But so typically you're dealing with a CUP or SCP process. The problem before this legislation was, since you weren't dealing with a rezoning, it did not put you in the realm of proffers in the conditional zoning sense. And if it's not a rezoning, it's a CUP or SCP. Before this legislation, you're very limited in the conditions you can impose. As you all know, you've all done this before. You've heard and approved conditional use permits and special exception permits. Those are typically, they're imposed. They're not negotiated in the sense of a proffer. They're typically very site specific. Buffers, fencing, hours of operation, noise limits, things like that. And so localities were, I think, in a bind since most of these cases were CUPs or SCPs, and some localities got creative, worked with the industry and entered into these voluntary payment agreements. But I think that was the only real avenue to sort of make it work for both sides. But I think this SCP bill is very important. I think it very clearly, for the first time, gives you the tools to accept cash payments that the need for that aren't solely, the need for which isn't solely generated by the facility, and other conditions that you previously didn't have statutory authority to accept or to impose. I mean, these permits are imposed. You know, they're not accepted. They're imposed. So you're gonna, that's why this was so important. Now you have that statutory authority to do that. Now it's still a discussion. I say it's imposed, but obviously it's a discussion with the applicant. You want to find something that works for both sides, and they only have so much threshold for in their business model for whether it's revenue sharing or cash through a permit process. So it's a balance. But the fact is, this gives you the authority to have that discussion and to put those conditions on there. And I think it's very useful. Now, I think there still needs to be some sort of connection to the project as far as what the conditions are, if there's any cash, what it's to mitigate or what it's to go towards. There should be some connection, some nexus, some legal nexus. Otherwise, you do run the risk of, an unconstitutional exaction and takings and that kind of thing. For instance, and the sort of segue to the standards bill that the delegate carried, House Bill, which one was that? The standards bill 657. No, that's the comp plan bill. The one that dealt with putting standards in your zoning ordinance. 656. That's an issue that I think you're going to all see more and more, and specifically with the battery storage. In my conversations with industry, the battery storage technology is getting to the point where it's much more advantageous and viable for them to store energy on site and be able to transmit that energy as needed, versus it having to go off the site when it's produced. So I think the storage technology is changing. So you're going to start seeing battery storage as a component of all these applications. And there are issues, frankly, concerns with battery storage. The technology is evolving. There have been incidents where there have been fires and tragedies from some of these facilities. And that's where this sort of links together with the special exception permit legislation. You can, I'm having discussions now in a locality where we're talking about an applicant in the CUP adding some conditions that directly deal with the battery storage, whether it comes to, providing training for the EMS staff, or even it could be some financial contributions to help shore up some, facilities that are needed locally to deal with any issues. So I think there should be some sort of nexus to the project in the conditions you impose. But still, there is a lot of latitude when you combine the special exception permit legislation with what's going to be talked about later, and that's the siting agreement, which is sort of akin to if you have a landfill and you have a host agreement. It's that kind of a situation where you're actually negotiating terms, and you have a lot of leeway under that siting agreement. So I'm looking forward to hearing Delegate Hodges and Tom Swartzwelder talk about that. But they all fit together. Like I said, the revenue share ordinance, if you're going to do that, what you can now do through the special exception process that you couldn't do before, you can really uniquely tailor it to these projects. And then the siting agreement. I think when it comes to the legislation on the comp plan, I think that's helpful. It could be the substantial accord process. Sometimes it's very important. Sometimes it's just a check the box. So I think to have the ability to waive that if you want to, I think that's fine. I think that can be a helpful tool. But there are times when the substantial accord termination is a very important one that needs to be vetted. It needs to be made by your planning commission and making a recommendation with citizen input. Some of these projects, depending on where they're placed or where they're proposed to be placed, and the surrounding land uses and surrounding neighbors, they're going to be it's going to be a close call sometimes on the stance from the court. So you're not going to necessarily always going to want to waive it. But having that tool can be helpful. So I think that's all I have, unless there's questions.
Jeff, there was one question a little bit earlier asking, when it comes to all of this, is the focus on industrial land or current farmland to put these solar projects on, with the concern being that if they are on current farmland, how, if at all, would that land be used later for later agricultural uses?
Yeah, I think that gets into, now decommissioning is not on our agenda today, but I think that is a very important issue when you're negotiating terms of a project, and typically the decommissioning will be in the CUP or SEP. But, you know, for instance, how will the permit require the land to be returned to its former state? I think that's what you're getting to, Chris, and the question is getting to, you know, this equipment goes down so many feet into the ground. If the idea is that in 20 or 5 or 30 years, the land will be returned to an agricultural production potentially, then that equipment has to be removed. Does it need to be removed to ground level? Does it need to be removed 3 feet under the ground, if that's how far it goes? So that's the kind of thing that needs to be thought about. And it can be different depending on where the site is, depending where the project is. You mentioned industrial. It could be in a location where there's really the foreseeable future that wouldn't be put into agricultural production. But if it's going to be, or if it could be, then I think that you need to think about those things when you're negotiating sort of the decommissioning terms.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate that.
Yeah, and this is Joe Lurch. I'll just add to that because, you know, we've been tracking kind of that issue for several years now, the potential loss of ag land and now forest land. And one of the things that, you know, we've been recommending is really review your comprehensive plan. One of the things that you can do is map out your agricultural soils of prime significance or statewide significance, and either through a comp plan review or your zoning ordinance, you can kind of set that land aside, you know, as just a comment to a much earlier slide showing the Virginia Clean Economy Act, the 16,100 megawatts goal for solar and wind on land. We kind of view the market for wind not very strong now, so I think that's going to be mostly solar. And just kind of penciling the math of about 10 acres per megawatt, you're looking at about 250 square miles of Virginia to meet that goal. Now, obviously, that's going to be dispersed in many areas, but it is a concern that I think many localities will have to think about carefully through their comprehensive plan and their zoning ordinances.
Okay. All right, Joe, thank you. And especially thank you to Delegate Heretic. And I appreciate you leaving that door open by saying that in all the partnership you've been with VACo and the door that you left open there that says, hey, we didn't get it right, let us know. I told somebody the solar power is like peeling an onion. You know, you fix one thing, you find something else. And I thank you for that, sir. I appreciate it. As well as you too, Jeff, for helping us out with these issues. Moving on, and I'm looking forward to hearing from, we've been very fortunate here to have another delegate with us, Delegate Keith Hodges. The Honorable Keith Hodges represents the 98th District in Virginia, the House of Delegates, which includes the counties of Essex, Gloucester, King and Queen, Matthews, Middlesex, and part of King William. As an elected leader in the region, Delegate Hodges orchestrated the region's first economic development summit, a rural coastal summit, and initiated the formation of the Middle Peninsula Alliance as a regional group charged with the economic development of the entire district. Created the Middle Peninsula Opioid Task Force and the Rural Coastal Economic Enhancement Authority. Speaking with him today, we got a county administrator with us from King and Queen County, and that's Tom Swartzwelder. Tom, before he came to King and Queen, he practiced in Atlanta and then with Kaufman and Coles in Virginia. He has served as a county attorney for 13 years and the county administrator for 12 years. He chairs the Middle Peninsula Planning District Commission, Middle Peninsula Regional Jail, and Middle Peninsula Regional Airport. And with that, gentlemen, I will turn it over to you, and thank you both for being here. and sharing some information with us. Thank you very much.
I don't know if we could hear Keith right now. I don't know if John's on, if you could maybe see if you could unmute Keith if he can't unmute himself.
Working on it. I can find him.
While we're waiting on that, I just want to throw a shout out to both Delegate Hodges and Delegate Heretic for working with us this session on it. It was, as they will tell you, it was quite a grueling session. There was more legislation than you would typically see even in a long session. And, I want to thank Delegate Heretic. He also chairs many subcommittees where a lot of other issues come through, and having his experience as a local government elected official was really helpful for us. And then, of course, Keith, represents a large swath of rural Virginia for many of our members, and has kind of been a longtime advocate on kind of protecting those kind of rural resources there that are assets for the community.
Joe, while we're waiting and John's trying to work on it, I do have one question you might want to address. The question follows: we have several large projects that have already made an application but have not been to the Planning Commission or board. The revenue sharing option will only apply on a voluntary basis. The SEP and CUP conditions are interesting, although as usual, the bill lacks some guidance, with the exception that it needs to be reasonably tied to the facility. The issue arises that solar has little or no impact. Can it be used to improve park facilities or school facilities? So what is a reasonable amount, or is there some per megawatt fee guidance that might be available?
Ooh, that's a good question. There was a lot there. I don't know if Jeff is still on, because I would punt to him being kind of the practitioner at the local level.
Joe, I think that's the good segue to our next session, because I think the most discretion to negotiate terms like that is in the siting agreement legislation.
Hey, this is Keith Hodges. Can y'all hear me?
Hey, Delegate.
Yes. Hey, it worked.
Hey.
Thank you.
Good with everybody today. And I really do appreciate it. Thanks for hosting this call. I know we have a number of folks from across the Commonwealth joining us, talking about a number of important issues. And one of those today, we're going to chat a little bit about House Bill 1675. And the idea for that legislation, which allows for really the development of a solar facility host agreement in disadvantaged localities, really came about from an ongoing discussion in the area that I represent. And that's the area, and Joe, you talked about it a second ago, the area of Virginia, we're between the York River, we're between the Rappahannock River, we're the Middle Peninsula. It's a great deal of attention from the developers, and we have those, we have the coast, we have the water, we have our natural resources, and as a result of being really over-regulated, we've been left behind when the rest of the state, when we look at it, at least through our lens, they're enjoying more than, economic vitality and broader economic vitality. And that's really how this discussion came about. Now, these solar facilities, they're generational projects. They're replacing, and as Delegate Heretic alluded to earlier, they're replacing productive farmland and productive forest land. And the idea came about, our localities had little or no way to negotiate with these solar companies that were looking to place the facilities in those regions, had little or no ability to negotiate. So we wanted to try to find a way to look at it in a different way. And the idea came up through a host agreement. And what host agreements, they've really been used by rural localities for a number of years in the Commonwealth to negotiate fair and reasonable benefits to projects. They've particularly been used over the years for landfills, and there's actually a code section dealing with landfills and host agreements. And the idea behind a host agreement was to make sure these projects benefit the community to negate any negative impacts. And when we look at, solar facilities, you're looking at the loss of agricultural land, you're looking at forest land. When we look at a 1,700-acre proposed project in one of the localities in the Middle Peninsula, you're looking at a loss of 10 agricultural jobs. Now, those 10 jobs, when many parts of the state look at that, doesn't seem like a lot, but when you compare that to, say, Fairfax County, that equates to 1,600 job loss in Fairfax County. That's a huge economic impact and a negative loss to the locality. So when you look at the host agreements, they're really considered mutually beneficial models used to balance the impacts that, say, a local community may experience in a hosting facility against the advantages received by the region. So in this case with solar, the advantages of the solar operation are important to the end user, who are typically not located even in the host locality. That end user can be far away in another part of the state. So for instance, a high-tech company in Northern Virginia, they want some renewable energy, but it's at the expense of locating that solar facility in, say, our region. So really the goal of 1675 is for the localities to use that host agreement to support programs that provide direct support to the disadvantaged community and residents within that locality. And I say, the disadvantaged because what this does is it requires an applicant seeking to locate either a commercial solar facility or a storage facility to work in that host county to execute that siting agreement prior to the issuance of allowing construction of the solar facility. And it applies to low-income census tracts, meeting the eligibility requirements for opportunity zones. And that's very important. And the opportunity zones are the economically distressed areas of the Commonwealth, where the new investments like solar facilities that may be eligible for preferential tax treatment. So opportunity zones, they are designated by the IRS. And I say eligible because these opportunity zones, it's not the named opportunity zones, but those census tracts that actually are eligible for opportunity zones. So it really opens up much larger area of the Commonwealth than just the named zones. And it would allow localities to have low-income census tracts to work with potential solar farms to use that host agreement to improve a disadvantaged community or the communities within the county. So that really lays it out. It's a totally different way of thinking. It's a totally different way of doing business for our localities. And I think that, if they use it in the right way, it can be very, very, very beneficial to them. I'm really very appreciative of VACo and all of the folks in all of the counties that supported this legislation during the General Assembly session. I do believe now that the Clean Economy Act, it's in our rearview mirror. There's a clear line of sight towards increased solar development in Virginia, and this bill really could be one of the most important pieces of legislation supporting our disadvantaged communities in rural Virginia in some time. And I'd also like to thank Delegate Heretic, if he's still on, for his hard work in getting this legislation, through, and his work on negotiating this bill as well behind the scenes a little bit. So with that, I just carried the bills. I'm not the person that really knows the ins and outs in local government and how things really operate. So I'm going to turn it over, unless there are any questions, I'd like to turn it over to Tom Swartzwelder of King and Queen County, who was very instrumental in constructing this legislation and helping to write the legislation and really negotiating the bill before the General Assembly this past year. So Tom, and also I would say my personal counsel, it's an inside joke, if any of you were there when we were presenting, but Tom was very, very helpful, and I can't thank him enough for all he did to get this legislation through. So this is, I do believe, monumental legislation and can help our localities all across the Commonwealth if we use the tools in the right manner.
All right, Keith, was that the official handoff?
That's the official handoff to my personal counsel.
Speaking of that, we need to talk about your bill. So thanks, Keith, and thank everybody who's gone sort of before me on this. And as said, all of this legislation really ties together in a nice package. And House Bill 1675, which, if you want to pull it up, is 15.2.23.16.6, is in many ways, if you're a baseball fan, is sort of the cleanup batter. It comes in sort of on the backside and allows you to do certain things, answer a lot of the questions that have been asked along the way. So I'm going to quickly walk through the bill and then kind of share some thoughts and ideas that I have or things that I learned during the session, as well as my experience in already starting to negotiate a site agreement. And I believe Jeff started that process as well. So it's interesting to see that the industry has embraced this legislation to the point that they are talking site agreements prior to it being in law. So the first thing that I would point out is just tie back into Keith's comment about low impact or low economically disadvantaged areas. Let's don't allow ourselves to view that as limiting. And Joe has the slide up now, but how the language of the statute defines an opportunity zone is a census tract in an area of a host locality meeting the eligibility requirements for designation as an opportunity zone. So you don't have to be designated, you just have to be able to be eligible. And the map that Joe has up is the DHCD map of eligible census blocks. And as you can see, virtually all of us in rural Virginia and many of us in urban Virginia fall into that category. So that enables you to access and use this code section. It only applies to projects that are larger than 5 megawatts, and it does not apply to the sort of customer generator type projects, a farm or a small person who has a small facility who sells the excess. We're really talking scale here. As Delegate Hodges pointed out, the interesting component here is that the applicant has to schedule a meeting by filing a written notice of intent to locate with your jurisdiction. So I would envision that as a letter from an applicant saying, we're considering locating a solar facility in your jurisdiction. We would like to begin negotiations with you on a site agreement. The magic word shall is in there, shall meet, discuss, and negotiate a siting agreement. Now, the code section doesn't require that you all reach an agreement, but it requires that you try. And there's some provision on the backside for that. And we'll go ahead and touch on that now. If you're unable to reach an agreement, you can use that as one of the components in your decision to deny a CUP, an SEP, or a rezone. It just cannot be your sole reason. So think about that for a minute. Those of us who live in the zoning world, there's frequently other issues cause problems for a zoning commission or a board of supervisors. Those issues combined with the inability to reach a siting agreement would be a valid reason to turn down a proposed project. The The siting agreement, this is where it gets a little bit broader than Delegate Heretic's bill, in that the siting agreement can include terms and conditions to mitigate impacts of the facility, much like his bill, or can be financial compensation to the host locality to address capital needs that are shown in your capital improvement plan, your current budget. So if you've got a project in your budget, you could ask for money for that. Anything that you've got budgeted in your fund balance policy, or for the deployment of broadband. So this section takes us out of there needing to be any nexus whatsoever to the project and links it to planned projects that your community has, as well as the deployment of broadband in the general sense. So it allows you just a little bit more flexibility if you want things that are, or you're not sure about whether the nexus is completely there and you're uncomfortable with it, then this would be a viable option for you to pull it out of Delegate Heretic's bill, perhaps, and say, well, you know, we're a little iffy on this one, so we'll put this one in a siting agreement. Once it's in the siting agreement, like I said, the nexus is then gone. The siting agreement is an enforceable contract, enforceable against subsequent boards of supervisors. So it, you know, it does have all the legal force and effect of a written contract. You will have to approve it in a public hearing, like you would any other statute or ordinance under 2204. There is a public process involved. If you do approve a siting agreement, then you automatically are declaring that it is substantially in accord. So 2232, it is substantially in accord with the comprehensive plan. So that extra hearing goes away because the siting agreement is the designation by the governing body that it is in compliance with the comprehensive plan. I think the interesting parts about this bill are the breadth of it and the participation by the industry. As Jeff alluded to earlier, throughout this solar development, it's been very difficult to come up with a way to have a financial discussion without getting into some sort of a proffer argument, which Delegate Heretic's bill was not an option, or a voluntary payment agreement with some people were uncomfortable with a voluntary payment agreement. Here you get to sit down with the applicant up front and share with them what financial challenges your jurisdiction has, what types of help you're looking for. It can be more than money. It can be land. It can be other things. It's what's in your comprehensive plan. It's what's in your capital improvement plan, and anything that you may have budget or that you're starting to set money aside for in some sort of a fund balance. So you have tremendous breadth there to negotiate this agreement and to really have an open conversation with the applicant about what the challenges of the community are. There are some things I would ask you to be mindful of in that, and I believe the two delegates and Jeff would agree in that there was some trepidation with this bill at the General Assembly, just a bit of fear that it could be abused. The locality would say, I want $200 million or you can't build your solar facility here. The industry went along with this bill in the assumption that everybody would be reasonable and make a good faith effort at negotiating a bill and not making it an extraction fee and an exaction fee, excuse me. So I think you should be mindful of that if you go down this path. What we don't want is to have to revisit this bill next year at the General Assembly, because this is a big step, I think, in local government law, in that we very rarely as jurisdictions are allowed to openly say, we want this, we need this. And this gives you that opportunity. So I hope that you all will avail yourselves of it, take it under consideration, combine it with the other bills that have already been discussed today. As Jeff pointed out, you could do it the revenue sharing bill. You could do things within your CUP under Mr. Heretic's bill, and you could still have a site agreement on the backside. You can avail yourselves of all of these different revenue sources. But like I said, the impetus behind this bill was to give you sort of an unfettered ability to negotiate. Happy to answer any questions.
Hey, Tom, this is Chris again. We did have one question in the comments It looks like Darren Coffey already addressed, but just wanted to bring it up here. We had a question, what if a project is only partially in an opportunity zone? Would this apply to the entire project? Darren already replied that it doesn't have to be in a zone, just eligible properties and those adjacent, but wanted to give you a chance to make a remark on that as well.
That's correct. And also look at the definition of opportunity zone in the actual code section, because not only does it say eligible, but it talks about the individual census tract. So the location of a portion of that in an eligible census tract would kick in the ability to use the siting agreement.
We had a follow-up question. We have a project in with preliminary site plan approval. It's by right zoning until we change to CUP in February, but it doesn't have final site plan approval. Would that still be eligible for a siting agreement?
The very last section of the code section states that this act shall not apply to any facility that has received zoning and site plan approval, preliminary otherwise, on or before January 1, 2020. So you would have to look at where you were in the process as of 1/1/2020.
So Tom, this is Joe following up that. So to be clear, if it has not been approved by January 1, 2020, you could potentially apply the host signing agreement. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Another question. Oh, go ahead, Tom. Sorry.
Well, what I was going to say is you be mindful of the fact that a little bit different from the revenue sharing bill, where the business or the applicant could choose to go back under that. In this particular scenario, if they have not been approved, then the locality can use the shall language and bring them to the table to negotiate a site agreement. It would not be voluntary on behalf of the applicant.
Are there any sample agreements that could be shared? I know it's probably early in this process. We have a couple of questions about that.
It is early in the process. I am in the process now of working one out with an applicant, and like I said, I believe Jeff is too. There are, I know that Gentry Lock is hoping to develop a model contract. Sort of that will be one that everybody likes or doesn't like, but I think probably by July there will be, or August, there will be some documents that could be shared.
Well, Joe, that wraps up the questions I have on my end.
Okay, any Joe, do you want to add anything before we head in our own directions?
Yeah, the only thing I'll say to participants on the call, thank you for being on. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a recording of this available for further viewing. You did get, hopefully you got copies of the slide deck, and we'll make those available. And then also the map you see on the last slide here, that was just a screenshot. I will actually provide a link to, it's actually an interactive mapping tool, so you can zoom in and zoom out in your particular locality to see how this would apply.
Okay.
Okay. Well, it's obvious that that the delegate Keith Hodges and the county administrator Tom Swartzwelder, you guys worked as a good team to get this House Bill 1675, and we really do appreciate it. And I'm hoping we're heading in the right direction, and I thank you for that. And with that said, I'm looking out the window, talking about solar power, but none of us seen the sun now for about 4 or 5 days. So, but anyway, I'm sure the sun is up there somewhere. So with that, look, guys, ladies, everybody, local officials, everybody today, and all the delegates, we thank you for having been here, and everybody stay safe and Godspeed to you. Thank you.